Hey US history, how are you guys doing today? Sorry, I just wanted to make one of my cats wanted to make an appearance. You can clearly tell she wants to be here right now. Let her go. Okay, good to see you guys. I hope you enjoyed chapter 19, learning a little bit about World War I and America's role in it. We're now moving on to the 20s. Very interesting decade in American history for sure. There's a lot to read on the objectives here because I'm trying to keep this at a moderate pace. So I basically combined the first 2/3 of the chapter into one sort of like lecture. Then next week we're gonna do the last part of it and we're gonna talk about the Federal Reserve a little bit. But anyways, there's a lot on here. You'll see these at the top of every slide. I'll talk about which objective we're on. So we're just gonna, to sum it all up, we're mainly just gonna be talking about the 20s, the presidents that came after Wilson, some of the economic changes, and some of the changes in thought during the time. So, okay, a lot to cover, so let's get started. Okay. Oh, and of course, read chapter 20 by May 6th. I think that would be a good day. If you can read the whole chapter by then, you'll be set for the rest of the chapter and for the test that's going to come after that. Okay, World War I, 1914 to 1918. We just talked about that. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria, and co. versus the Allies, America, Britain, France, etc., etc. After the whole war ended, America was actually doing pretty well economically, as a nation anyway. And the other countries were all, they depleted all their money, they'd lost a lot of men, a lot of resources, and the other countries were not doing so well. So we'll talk about what that looks like. Before we do, what was it like if you were a soldier? Remember doughboys, right? That's the name for the US soldiers. Doughboys that were coming back from the wars, or some of the battles over in Europe. They were coming back to an economy that was not exactly very good. The United States job market was pretty weak. And to put this into perspective, you have to understand that the quick transformation that once a war is over, an economy has to change back to peacetime, and it takes time. When a world war breaks out or a significant war, you'll notice an entire country changes. All the machine shops change to start making parts and munitions and all sorts of things for the war. Farmers are growing certain types of crops and growing an abundance of those crops to supply the men on the fields and the people at home. So you have economic transformation when war happens, but when war ends, it takes time to transfer back to what they were before. So a lot of the machine shops were retooled to be made, again, for war supplies. And now all of a sudden the war is over, there's not a need for bombs and all the stuff they were making for the war, so now they have to go back to what they were doing before, and that takes time to retool machines. And on top of that, the demand has been pretty low, and now it's sort of recalibrating itself when an economy is getting back into the peacetime mode of buying and investing in business and whatnot. So industry was slow. And on top of that, agriculture faced some hard times as well. During the war, farmers actually had it pretty good, because what was happening was they were growing all sorts of crops to supply the troops, supply Americans at home, but also they were sending over crops to Europe. Europe was buying all sorts of crops because, sorry, but it's hard to farm in France when you're being battered by the Germans, so they needed to get their food somewhere. So America was shipping crops over to Europe. But here's the problem. As soon as the war ended, all of a sudden you have farmers that were making good money. You had all sorts of people who saw the profit in farming that dropped all they were doing and invested all sorts of land and machinery to become farmers themselves. So you have all these farmers growing tons of crops, and now the demand has plummeted because Europe doesn't need it anymore because they're growing their own crops again. So all of a sudden, what happens when you have an abundance of crops and not many people buying them is the price for those crops plummets. This is basic economics, supply and demand. When your supply is way high, the demand is not proportionally as high, then you're going to see a huge drop in price. So that's what happened, is the crops were worth virtually nothing and they could barely sell them. So you had all these farmers who are now already in debt because they got in debt to get into farming to make money during the war. All of a sudden now they're not making any money, they can't pay off their debts. So if you're a soldier returning from Europe, it was hard to find a job, at least at first. The 20s is going to boom in a little bit, but for now, it was kind of a weak job market when they came back. Again, industry and agriculture both adjusting to that post-war living. Now, what about the America's foreign policy during the 20s? Again, so Wilson was that idealist. He had all these great ideas, right, to fix the world's problems. So America wants to be a little bit more detached, right? We want to be what's called isolationist, which isn't really the fairest of terms. You could say non-interventionist is probably a better way to put it, but this is the textbook's nomenclature. But isolationist meaning we want to, work with other nations, but we don't want to be involved in their military affairs, really. We don't want to have allies that we get tangled into more fights. So isolationism was, according to the book, was the general theme of the 20s. But the United States didn't really have a choice anymore. It's kind of like if you're in a if you're in like a classroom setting and you're the biggest guy there and there's bullying happening all around you, it kind of comes down to you to do something, you know, especially if you've helped in the past and now they're kind of looking at you. Even if you don't want to fight, you're kind of obligated to do something to stop the bullies. So in this case, there weren't really bullies, but the United States was being looked at because they had all the money. We had all the money. We had the way to stabilize the world. Yet we didn't want to be in the League of Nations. So what are we going to do? Well, we had the Washington Naval Conference, and this is an American-led effort to help nations negotiate. We don't need to go into the specifics, but basically, nations agreed to slow their military expansion, how many ships they were making, and how many weapons. Japan felt they got the short end of the stick, and they did, honestly. So Japan left very unhappy, and they just did what they wanted and kept making weapons. But there were some limits put on at least some weapons. But honestly, it wasn't extremely effective because, like, submarines, for example, didn't have limits. So there were things that people could keep making as much as they wanted of. But it was an American attempt, though, to try to stabilize the world and to try to bring some order. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was another important thing that was passed during this time. And in my opinion, it's most naive thing. It was praised back in the 20s, but basically, it was somebody in Coolidge. It was Kellogg in Coolidge's administration was like, "Hey, let's just make war illegal." You know, that's like how many times you heard people say, "Hey, if we make drugs illegal, then people will stop doing drugs." You know, the law, you know, it's not going to work. And here's the thing, though: at least with drug laws, you can enforce them, right? If someone's doing meth, they get in trouble with the law. With the Kellogg-Briand Pact, they just made it illegal, but there's no way to enforce it. So France and Russia start fighting. You know, it's going to take a really powerful nation to somehow be the arbiter. It just doesn't make sense because there's no way to enforce making war illegal. Extremely naive, and this goes back to progressivism, the idea that the world is getting better and that Christians should, you know, not even just Christians, but Americans should try to make the world better, that, you know, human nature is changing. The Christian worldview would say, you know, human nature isn't that easy. We're born inherently selfish, born evil, and that there's a little bit too much faith you're putting in the malleability of human nature there. So this is where it gets interesting too, though. So now that's America trying to stabilize things, and in the midst of all of this, you have economic issues galore. So this might be a little bit complex, but this will definitely be test-worthy stuff, so pay attention to this, because I want you to get this. Germany owed reparations. They owed debt to other nations, right? In Europe, right? So they were ravaged, war-torn, they didn't have any money. The United States, on the other hand, had loaned a bunch of money to the European nations during the war. So what's happening now is kind of interesting. Germany owes a bunch of money to Europe, and Europe owes a lot of money to us. So Germany doesn't have any money. They can't get any help from, obviously, the rest of Europe. So Germany starts borrowing money from us to pay back. So I'll use the clicker here. So Germany starts borrowing money from the United States to pay off Europe around it. And then Europe is paying us loans, or paying us back for the loans that we gave them. So it's this ridiculous debt cycle. Our money's going to Germany, which is going to the Allied nations, which is coming back to us. And what made it so difficult was, and again, with interest and all that part of it too, but what made it so difficult was that Europe didn't have gold, and the United States demanded gold for payment, right? So Europe wanted to trade goods, like crops or textiles, whatever, but the United States put the Fordney McCumber tariff as an extremely high tariff so that nobody from Europe would bother trading with us because the tariff was too high, they couldn't make any money. So ultimately what happened was that blocked Europe from being able to use anything except gold to pay us back. But again, we were loaning money to Germany, and Germany was loaning money to the European nations, and so it's a bit of a mess, as you can see. It's called the debt cycle. We did loosen up a little bit on Germany and the Allies because they were upset that we were just basically making tons of money off of them. So the Dawes Plan did loosen up things a little bit, but we continued to make money off of the whole arrangement. So I hope that makes sense. Again, just so you get it, because I know it's kind of complex. Germany was borrowing money from the United States to pay off the Allied nations, France and England and the others, and then they were paying us back for the money that they borrowed from us during the war. So again, that's just a big cycle of money flow. So it's a little bit messy, as you can see. So how about the politics of the whole thing? That's a little bit of the economy, but what happened with the politics? So after Wilson, people kind of were fed up with the Democratic Party for a while, so which you tend to see in US history, so it swung back to Republican leadership. And Warren Harding, interesting guy, He basically just looked like a president. That's what people said. He just looks like a president. He just looks presidential. I remember back George W. Bush, back when he ran. I need to verify this, but somebody told me they saw a poll, and the majority of people that, according to this poll anyway, voted for him because he seemed like the kind of guy you could just sit and have a beer with. so like he just looked like a cool guy. We'll go with him. Sure, why not? But in the same way, Warren Harding kind of looks the same way. He just looked like a president. And his statement was return to normalcy. That's what he said. America's had enough of idealism. Again, Wilson was an idealist academic, right? So Warren Harding said, we're just going to return to normalcy. We're going to go back to being a peaceful nation that makes money and enjoys our life. And that's exactly what I think what the nation needed during that time. We'd had enough of massive wars and idealism. So people loved him too, and they voted him in pretty substantially. He was an honest guy, but his Ohio gang, he's from Ohio, and he had some friends that he brought into his cabinet, and they turned out to be schemers. And it was actually right after Warren Harding died of a heart attack, but the Teapot Dome scandal, something you'll read in any U.S. history book. And what happened was Albert Fall, who was Warren's Secretary of Interior, basically took control of some oil reserves. This is government property, but he leased this government property to some buddies who provided a little bit of payment to him for extracting the oil. So basically he was, to make that easy to understand, he was basically letting his friends use government land to get a bunch of oil so they would get rich, and then they would give him money that they got from the whole thing. That's obviously not good. You're not supposed to use government land to profit for yourself. So that got exposed and he got in big trouble for that. And so anyways, that's the big thing about, because that happened technically during Harding's term, that's something that we talk about as being being associated with Warren Harding. But again, technically it was exposed right after he died. But after he died in 1923, his vice president becomes president. Now who is Warren Harding's vice president? Do you know who? We need a moment of silence, I think, before we proceed. It's just so beautiful. Just so beautiful. Some, like me, refer to him as His Eminence. Are you ready? Ready? Well, it should be noted that others admire his brevity of speech and whatnot. Oh, okay. Oh, and he was an exemplar of Christian values too, just saying, you know. 1, 2, 3. He was pretty awesome. I mean, come on, pretty awesome dude. I think we need a few more minutes to prepare. Why don't we just all take a break right now? I'll go get a drink and just prepare ourselves a little bit. Okay, seriously. This is getting old. Behold his greatness, Calvin Coolidge. If you ever looked at my desk, I have a massive portrait of Calvin Coolidge hanging up behind it. So, oh, it's pretty amazing. So what happens is, I call him His Eminence. He's pretty much my favorite president. I think he was extremely interesting of a person. I mean, phenomenal, great character. There's so many things I love about Calvin Coolidge. I'll be honest with you though, I probably wouldn't want to spend a day with him just because he's kind of odd and doesn't talk much. I mean, there's other presidents that are probably funner to hang out with, but he's a fun dude. I mean, he's just an interesting guy. So here's what you need to know about Calvin Coolidge. He took a really laissez-faire or a hands-off approach. He said minimal government, let the market regulate itself, and a lot of conservatives say amen to that. He was known for saying the business of America is business. Now this is not actually accurate. Our book says this, but I've read plenty of works. I read his biography and by a reliable scholar, and the scholar noted that that's a misunderstanding. It's actually, what he said is the chief business of America is business. A lot of times people on the left accuse him of being a money grubber, that all that matters, the only business of America is business. That's not what he said. He said the chief business of America is business, meaning that's an extremely important part of what we do as a nation, is focus on the market, making money, and in commerce and exchange. He was popular, and he never really had any serious flaws as a president. People liked him. And, turn this off, sorry. He finished his term, and he ran again. And even though he technically could have continued, he decided not to. But you know, he was a popular guy who was just really pretty much a minimalist, you know. Here's a few stories about Calvin Coolidge. Number one, his temperament. He was just really laid back. Like, there's stories I read about his wife was kind of a social butterfly, and she took him to a party once when they were dating, and he just sat on a chair and stared for I think it was 2 hours. He just stared, did not say a word to anybody. He had the shortest State of the Union address. It was, I think, 4 sentences long one time. Here's a funny story about him too, the You Lose story. people always joked about how they called him Silent Cal, by the way, you know, because he didn't talk much. And the White House staff had a running joke that when anybody came to visit the White House, they'd always joke, if you can get Calvin Coolidge to say more than 2 words, we'll give you money. So what happened is, one time this lady walked up and heard that story, so she walked up to Calvin Coolidge and said, hey, I heard that if I can get you to say more than 2 words, then I'm going to win some money. And Calvin just smiled and said, you lose, and walked away. Pretty brilliant. Another funny story is the Coolidge effect. This is a little bit PG-13, but I'll say it anyway. When Calvin and his wife were visiting a farm, they noticed that there was this, I think it was, oh man, it's been a while now that I think about it. I think it was hens and a rooster, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, it talked about how the rooster can just mate all day. You just keep going and keep going. And so Mrs. Coolidge made a joke and said, you should tell Calvin about that. You know, this male rooster is able to just keep having sex, whatever. And then Calvin Coolidge asked, well, why is it that he's able to do that? And then the farmer says, well, it's because he has several chickens. And so in biology, I guess that when there's several females present, a male can sort of up the ante and keep going. So then he said, why don't you tell that to Mrs. Coolidge? And so that's actually, look it up, that's called the Coolidge effect in biology, is when a male is able to perform and do more than he could normally in the presence of multiple females. So it's kind of a funny joke about Calvin and his wife. And lastly, I should mention Ronald Reagan is considered to be one of the best presidents typically by conservatives. And Ronald Reagan loved Calvin Coolidge. He put up a portrait of Calvin Coolidge. I forget, not in the Oval Office, but I think it was one of the meeting rooms. He took down, I think, Truman's picture, and he put up Calvin Coolidge's instead, I believe. But whoever it was, he put up Coolidge though because he admired his policies and he admired his bravery. Because there was a specific time when Coolidge was governor of Massachusetts, and the Boston police force went on strike, and he fired them all. And he said, you don't ever strike against the public safety anywhere or anytime. And after he fired not the entire police force, but everybody who went on strike, Samuel Gompers, the famous AFL, that union leader who was a socialist, attacked Calvin Coolidge, and he told Calvin, and that's what Calvin Coolidge told him, is you don't ever strike against public safety. And here's the thing, after World War I, when even though we came out victorious, people were starting to get nervous because the Bolshevik Revolution had just happened. Socialism was getting really popular in Russia. It's called the Red Scare. People in America were afraid of the specter of socialism and communism coming to America. So when they heard about Coolidge being brave and sticking it to the unions, which were socialists, they thought that he was even more awesome because he was definitely not a socialist. So a little bit about Calvin Coolidge there. Again, he literally passed around slips of paper after he ran for president. So he fulfilled Harding's term, and then he ran for his own term. But instead of running again, he passed out slips of paper that simply said, I have chosen not to run for president. Didn't ever really explain why. And we think it's probably because his son died and he was dealing with a lot of depression. But in any case, he was done. But did a good job. And during his time, the economy certainly boomed. It got a lot of money was flowing around America during that time. Okay, so after Coolidge, Herbert Hoover was the guy who ran next. Now, it's as important terms to understand in the 1920s. Herbert Hoover was called the Dry. If you were a Dry, that means that you were against alcohol. You wanted the government to prohibit alcohol for all people. If you were a Wet, then that means that you wanted the government to allow the consumption of alcohol. And so what happened was Herbert Hoover was a Dry, and he won against Al Smith in 1928. Typically, Irish and Roman Catholics and a lot of Germans liked alcohol, and so they didn't want it to be made illegal, but you had a lot more your Protestants, conservative and liberal Protestants, who tended to be more for prohibition because they thought it might alleviate poverty, they might make the world a better place. We'll see how that goes. But when Herbert Hoover became president, poor guy, within a year of him becoming president, the stock market crashed. And of course, everybody's going to blame him, even though it wasn't really his fault. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, when the stock market crashes and you're in charge, all of a sudden everybody points to you. But clearly, you have to look at all the years before and what led up to the stock market crash in the first place. Okay, so moving on. So the next objective is we're going to talk about the effect of some thinkers during the 20s, Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. This isn't a psychology class, nor is it a physics class, so I'm not going to say much, but Albert Einstein developed the theory of relativity, and this really did kind of mess with the psyche of America because everybody since Newton had taught that everything's static. There's cause and effect, and everything is easy and definable, measurable, and that's it. But the theory of relativity basically talks about how there aren't really any absolutes in nature, and it's all relative to motion and time and place where you're at. And so that caused people to start questioning the fabric of reality. So obviously that's going to have an effect on the American conscious. Sigmund Freud, speaking of conscious, was a psychologist during this time, and he opposed this idea of like mortification of sin and self-restraint. He basically proposed all sorts of theories about how the human brain works. I have over here a diagram. The conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. Freud believed that what you're thinking about right now is the conscious. Your preconscious basically deals with, or you could also say the superego, the ego, the id, it's another way to put it. But your preconscious or your ego basically deals with the things that you could drop pretty fast. What's your middle name? You know, you're not thinking about right now, but you could pull it up pretty easily, right? Or what's your address? That's your preconscious. But the unconscious is the bulk of how you think and what you do. That's all your hidden feelings and your hidden emotions and things from your upbringing that have been imprinted on you that you may not even know about. You know, why do you tend to be more of a fearful person, or why do you have this particular lust or something? And so Freud had this whole idea of how humans think, and definitely not a Christian, he was an atheist. And honestly, I'd recommend, there's actually a really good documentary from PBS, and they compare Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis. And Sigmund Freud was interesting because he attended school with and had a Jesuit professor he admired. He admitted he could not defeat his professor's arguments for the existence of God. Freud admitted, I can't refute this guy. His arguments make perfect sense. Yet Freud continued to be an atheist and ended up becoming an extremely influential psychologist. But again, coming back to the fact that human nature is malleable, and ultimately don't restrain yourself, but let it all sort of hang out. You know, open up about your issues and maybe even live into them if possible. Okay, the 18th Amendment, as we were talking about a little bit ago, was ratified in 1919. This outlawed the manufacture, sale, or transportation of liquor. So you can see in this picture they're dumping out a bunch of booze. And people thought if we just make alcohol illegal, people will stop drinking it, right? Easier said than done. And what happened is you had a few things happen during this time. We've talked about this before, but NASCAR was actually something that comes from the Prohibition. What happened was people were learning how to soup up their cars so that they could go really fast and they could outrun the Prohibition officers. But after the Prohibition ended with the 21st Amendment, they said, what are we going to do with these fast cars? Oh, I know, let's just race them. So then they started racing these old Prohibition runner cars in circuit tracks, and NASCAR started from that. You've probably heard the expression bootlegging. I have a bootleg DVD, I have a bootleg video game, whatever. Bootleg comes from this time because people would hide flasks of alcohol in the leg of their boot. And then they would pass it under the table, heard that too, for cash to somebody. So bootlegging became something really popular during this time. People would hide booze in their boots. They called the places that would serve alcohol illegally speakeasies because you would speak easy, meaning you'd whisper, you'd talk softly. So speakeasies, there's some in Kansas City. That might be a fun field trip one day, actually, is to go see what they did. They had everything. They had collapsible shelves. If the prohibitionists were coming, they'd pull a rope and the shelves would collapse and all the booze would fall into a hidden compartment. I mean, it got pretty elaborate. And then, of course, you have moonshine. They would illegally distill whiskey out in the woods, and you could see the moon shining on the liquid, hence moonshine. Sometimes they called it white lightning as well. But they would create this stuff out in the woods, and it was not very safe. People were adding all sorts of additives, like embalming fluid, for example. And I've heard stories, actually, this is kind of creepy, but you can see there were coffins that they've dug up from this time with claw marks from the inside, because people would pass out from some of the types of alcohol they were drinking, and their heart would be so weak. It was working, but you couldn't even feel it, that people assumed they were dead, so they would bury them alive by accident. And so some people woke up sadly in the grave and couldn't get out. So maybe it's good to have some regulations on what we put in the stuff we eat and drink. Just saying. But a little bit of an interesting thing about the Prohibition, some of the facts there. Some of the cons, though. So you might think it's great, we're going to end alcohol. That means no drunkenness. That means no public fighting, et cetera, et cetera. Or not, public drunken fighting, I should say. Well, you also had a bunch of problems. When people want something and it's illegal, then they're going to get it anyway. And so what happens is there are people who break the law to supply this demand. Hence, you have crime. You have a whole underground. Al Capone, Scarface, his name, was the king of the Chicago underworld, and that became a very safe place for, became an infamous place, rather, for producing alcohol. And you had all sorts of massacres, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, look that one up. It was horrible. It was crime and lots of money to be made with booze, illegally made. But that's what happened during this time. When you put such a blanket ban on something that people are going to do anyway, then you're going to have a crime market develop to supply it. As I said, the liquor was unsafe, and that was creepy. And of course, you know, even a lot of politicians thought it was unreasonable. They thought it was just religious zealousness, which is kind of what it was, to be honest. So nobody really took the law that seriously. Even Calvin Coolidge, when he was president of the Prohibition, and somebody asked him about it, and he hinted that he thinks it's a stupid law, but the law needs to be followed, is basically what he said. Well, the law is a law, even though he said, but when a large portion, he said, when the vast majority of the population doesn't follow it, though, then you may need to question if the law should be there in the first place. He said something to that effect. So that was the 18th Amendment. The 21st Amendment in 1933 repealed the 18th. This is the only time we've actually repealed an amendment. And it was the first amendment where states all came together and sort of brought it up to the federal government because they were sick of it. So you can see in this picture, a bunch of people are celebrating at a bar the end of the 18th Amendment. So I thought that was kind of funny. Now, during this time, you also had, what about the attitudes of Americans toward immigrants and blacks in the 1920s? This is where you had the formation of the first Democratic Party's community activist group, the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, you heard that right. It was the Democratic Party, because during this time, the Democratic Party was the party centered mainly in the South. And of course, you know, you're going to have some holdouts up north as well. But the Ku Klux Klan was a selective ritualistic group that promoted 100% Americanism, kind of like the Know Nothings before the Civil War. Again, they didn't just dislike blacks, they also disliked Catholics and Jews as well, but they especially didn't like blacks, the Ku Klux Klan. You have the Sacco Vanzetti case. 2 Italian men were murdered during a robbery, and they were convicted. These Italian men were convicted and executed with no solid evidence, and this looked really bad. Basically, because they were immigrants from Mediterranean Europe, they were considered not really worth the time of day to actually give a fair trial to, so they weren't really given their due process, and they were executed, and that caused some stir in the media. Again, it's hard for us to imagine that, but there were times where like people from Italy were not liked here. The Irish were hated. They called Irish like mix, you know, and stuff like that. And Italians were called wops, without papers. It was a derogatory term, or greasers, you know, from like the whole Mediterranean area. So this is an example of where men were murdered, where they supposedly murdered 2 other men, and they were executed without having a fair trial. So it didn't look good on our justice system. Okay, we're almost there, you guys. I know it's kind of a long lesson, but thank you for bearing with me. The rise of fundamentalism in the 1920s. Now, also in the 1920s, this is a really important thing to understand too. Germany had been developing what's called higher criticism, looking really deep into the text, who wrote what, questioning certain key biblical doctrines. So in the 1920s, you had Christians who were committed to their faith who said, we're going to oppose this German higher criticism and textual criticism. And so what happened was there were Christians who came out with a series of essays called The Fundamentals, and that laid out the fundamentals of the Christian faith. Now, to be fair here, and this is where we get fundamentalism, by the way, and fundamentalism from the fundamentals. But if the Germans, they definitely were too far on one side of the spectrum, but sadly, the fundamentalists were way too far on the other side. Extreme biblical literacy and hyper-literalness, and if you didn't agree with them, you probably weren't saved. The fundamentalist modernist controversy was a big debate over doctrine. You had some Christians who were more on the modernist/liberal side, and others who were on the fundamentalist/really conservative side. And what happened was there were like a lot of breakouts from these traditional denominations, and you had breakaways where people created more conservative denominations. There's plenty of examples. Look at, for example, you have the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That's a major mainline Protestant denomination. They're liberal though, they're modernist, you could say. And yet you have the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church that broke off, and the Wisconsin Synod Lutheran churches. And those are 2 different churches that are much more conservative, that broke off from that liberal church. And even pretty recently, the Episcopal Church is way wacky left field. And you had the Anglican Church of North America broke off from them in 2009. So we still see that happening today, where you have a traditional denomination that's gone really modernist or really liberal, and then you have a breakaway where conservatives will create their own denomination. Another thing I should mention during this time is after World War I, people thought, man, we're not that far from the end of the world, and premillennialism got really popular as well. And premillennialism teaches that there's going to be a moment where Christ returns and raptures up the church. Then there's going to be 7 years of chaos, basically of a tribulation. And then Christ is going to return with the church, and there's going to be a 1,000-year literal reign where Christ reigns as king of the world for 1,000 years. Then you have a final battle, Armageddon, and then you have the eternal state. Many of you probably heard this before, but premillennialism was not popular until the early 1900s. Once you had this crazy big war happening, people thought, man, the end of the war really is imminent, isn't it? So again, premillennialism, before millennialism, millennial. Basically, Christ is going to return before the millennial reign. So Christ returns, raptures up the church, the Antichrist wreaks havoc for 7 years, and then he's locked away, and then Christ returns with the church. And there's a 1,000-year reign of peace, that's the millennium. And then afterwards you have the Battle of Armageddon, and the devil meets his final doom, and then you have the new heaven and new earth. That's premillennialism, and it got really popular during this time. Okay, and one more thing worth mentioning, then I think we'll call it, because this is a long lesson, but the Scopes trial. John Scopes was a Tennessee teacher, and he broke the state law of Tennessee that said you can't teach evolution. Believe it or not, during this time, teaching evolution was illegal in a lot of states. So this teacher intentionally broke the law, and by the way, he was encouraged by some on the left to do this because they wanted to cause a scene. So he did. He taught evolution, he got in trouble, and then you had a trial. And what happened was you had a brilliant agnostic lawyer named Clarence Darrow who defended Scopes. That was the teacher who taught evolution. The prosecution was aided by William Jennings Bryan. We've been talking about him, a Midwestern guy who's definitely on the more conservative side, and he debated with Clarence Darrow. Sadly, William Jennings Bryan, although he's a great politician and has good character, he wasn't really equipped to handle Clarence Darrow. So Clarence Darrow asked him some really good questions just about the Bible that William Jennings Bryan couldn't answer. For example, if you read Genesis, it talks about how Cain, after he gets in trouble with God, he goes off to the land of Nod, and it says he knew his wife. And then people have asked, well, who was his wife? Although the Bible talks about Cain and Abel, right? And then it just sort of in Seth, but then like, who did he marry if those were the only humans? Now, there is an answer. If you read ahead a little bit more in Genesis, then you read the full chronology and there were sisters, so you could, it's not an unbeatable argument. It's actually not a good argument. But William Jennings Bryan wasn't aware that if you just read a few chapters ahead, you'd find the whole list of Adam and Eve's descendants and that Cain probably married one of his sisters. But again, he didn't know how to answer this, and so it looked really bad. So in the end, what happened was the fundamentalists won the court battle. Scopes taught evolution, it was against the law, so he got in trouble. But the publicity battle was definitely won by Clarence Darrow, and it made Christianity look stupid and backwards, sadly. So the Scopes trial is an important event in our nation's history. Okay, and I think we are, yeah, we're gonna cut it at this because this is a lot to go through. So we'll cut it here. There we go, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so I forgot to put up the this week slide, but if you want to see what to do this week, go to Google Classroom, go to the start here. I do this every single week, and I give you a list of everything you need to do. Just check that for the week. Thank you for bearing with me in this long lecture, you guys. I love you guys, and I'll talk to you soon. See you, bye.